begin with that. The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. It's going to take me a moment to adjust. Thank you all for being here this morning. Let's see, go in this view and do that thing. So, for those I haven't met, my name is Sarah. My Dharma name is Dojin, and I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm one of the head priests at Stone Creek. And welcome to Sunday morning, the Sunday morning Dharma talk. This week, actually, in the Soto Zen tradition, we celebrate Buddha's birthday on April 8th, which apparently was an impact of some cultural overlap with, what's it? The German thing?
The date isn't.
Okay.
Just Haramatsuri.
Haramatsuri. Was an overlap with spring flower celebration, Blumenfest. Anyway, I just think it's kind of lovely that things that we think of as traditional actually have all this global kind of interaction in them. So a Japanese celebration of Hanamatsuri, which is the celebration of Buddha's birth, actually probably has some German influences of when and how it happens, and vice versa. And in our Sangha, I also did want to acknowledge that April 8th is also now, for those of us who knew and loved Alice Jean, the anniversary of her death. So we came together with some Sangha members and friends of hers and family on Thursday to have a memorial for her and honor her crossing over, and a year that it's been since that happened. But I'm not going to talk about Buddha's birthday today, not explicitly anyway. It'll be interesting to see if I see some parallels with what I want to talk about, and I hope that you will as well. What I want to talk about actually, or what's been very much on my mind and heart, is the culture of well, really the best word for it, or the most accurate word, is of dehumanization. So the influences of dehumanization in the world, and for me, in the cultures I move around in my cultural conditioning. And in the book Caste, written by Isabel Wilkerson, she writes, which is about the intersection of caste and race. She uses the concept of caste to explain racial oppression in the United States and racial violence, and the forms that it takes and continues to take. She says, dehumanization is a standard component in the manufacture of an outgroup against which to pit an in-group. And this is super important, I think, it is a monumental task. It is a war against the truth, against what the eye can see and the heart could feel if only allowed to do so on its own. To dehumanize another human being is not merely to declare that someone is not human, and it does not happen by accident. It is a process and a programming. It takes energy and reinforcement to deny what is self-evident in another member of one's own species. So Isabel Wilkerson is pointing to something that feels very alive for me, which is that human beings naturally understand other human beings to be human. And I would argue, and I know there's arguments to be made against this, but I would also argue that we understand that on our deepest level, we understand that all humans have equal worth. And so that when we are foisted into systems, and there are many of them, and especially in the United States, there are many of them, and by we, I mean we human beings, when we're foisted into environments where we are supposed to pit groups one against another or ourselves against others, that we're actually in a process that's counter to our fundamental nature, and or counter to something that maybe not our like our singular fundamental nature, but that's counter to something that's very fundamental within us, which is to recognize other human beings as other human beings, and to recognize the value, the equal value of all of us. To begin with, in terms of Zen practice, I wanted to talk about a practice that we engage with in monastic setting. So when Charlie and I and many other people lived at the monastery at Tassajara, which is a Soto Zen monastery, for half of the year it functions like solely as a monastic training center, and then a lot of those monastic forms carry over into the other half of the year when it opens as a retreat center. There's a practice of whenever you cross paths with someone, and even sometimes when you're passing each other in the same direction, but mostly when you're crossing paths with one another, we bow to one another. And the form is actually that you stop and bow. My job, often I worked in maintenance and the physical plant of the of Tassajara. Sometimes I was often running. We weren't supposed, actually one of the forms that we had at Tassajara was to not run through the monastery. I was often running though, because like pipes were breaking and things like that were happening. And even then, the form is to stop. It's like the way you stop at a stop sign. Like you don't just kind of pause-ish. You have to stop all the way, plant your feet, and bow to one another, and then continue. It's a really, it's a beautiful form. It's a beautiful teaching. The way I experienced it. It has a really, it can be really impactful when you're having a hard time with people. Like it doesn't matter if you're in an argument with somebody, if you're, having a mediated intervention, you still stop and bow. And to me, it was this expression over and over again of like, I see you. We, human beings, like we see each other, we notice each other. We can learn to pretend that we don't. And in some situations that it's adaptive to do that, sort of, although I would argue that it always is diminishing. but we, there's this beautiful thing that it's an embodied practice of saying, I see you, I see you, I see you. And I see me seeing you. I see me having to stop what I'm doing and bow to you. Our daughter Kaya was actually born at Tassajara and lived there for the first year and a half of her life. And it was always so amusing and interesting to go with her outside of Tassajara. I mean, most people, even adults, have the experience if you live at Tassajara, like especially if you've been there all winter and you've been doing that form, and then you leave to go, visit family or go on vacation or something. You kind of have to stop yourself from bowing in public when you cross other people. And even sometimes you do it by accident and then you just try to play it off like, oh, I was just, looking down. And actually internally, I would always do it. Like it just became a posture in my mind. So when I would cross people, I would at least always look at them and feel that sense of bowing, that kind of reverent, that moment of reverence of recognition. And when Kaya was a baby, I remember several times moving through an airport with her, and she was moving in this funny way. And when I looked to see what she was doing, it was because she was super disoriented by people not looking at her and regarding her. Like her normal mode of being was at Tassajara, where everyone was stopping to acknowledge one another. And then usually they were like melting around the baby. And you could feel her body was confused by moving through an airport and people were ignoring her. She was moving around on my shoulder like, why aren't you looking at me? And I think of that. I think of this because I feel like it's a teaching about, again, like it almost like reminds us of something more fundamental, which is we do see each other. And it's in such contrast to when we move through environments, when we're asked to kind of pretend that we don't see each other, or, those other people are not my business, or I can't be bothered. I have things to do. I'm a busy person. I can't stop to bow to you either internally or externally. But I recommend it as a practice that we could take up, even if secretly. You could try walking down the street bowing to people, but people might get a little flustered or irritated outside of a monastery. But I recommend like taking it in as an internal practice, a posture, a moment of pause and reverence for other human beings whenever we see one another. And when I was thinking about, so as Isabel Wilkerson is pointing to, any system or any situation where we are asked to elevate some and denigrate others is actually a system of dehumanizing. And it's running counter to our natural understanding that we are all equally valuable. And as I was thinking about that over the past few weeks, the precept of not killing came to mind as a real support for counteracting these kind of systems that say that some people are more worthy or more valuable than others. The thing that I think is so beautiful in some ways about all of Buddhist practice and especially the precepts is that we can work with them on every level simultaneously. So we can have the precept of not killing as, don't willfully kill things, and then like make every effort to not even unconsciously kill living beings. But we can also work with that precept on very subtle levels, which is the understanding that this precept is guiding us that whenever we're cutting off life or cutting off the fullness of vitality, we are moving in a direction that is likely to be unskillful or harmful or counter to our values as bodhisattvas. We can apply this internally, So when we are diminishing ourselves or elevating ourselves internally, but I would say the one we can catch more often is when we're diminishing ourselves, we can bring that activity into the light of the precept of not killing and wonder about it and remember like, oh wait, it's unskillful. It causes unskillful outflows to cut off the fullness of valuing life. And when I shame myself or when I diminish myself, that's actually a violation of that precept. And I'm actually probably moving in a direction of creating more suffering. That's what I think the precepts do for us. It's not like a rule that, if we violate that, we're going to hell. I mean, actually, it is kind of metaphorically. When we violate the precept of not killing, we're creating a kind of, we're setting up the situation for suffering, which is a kind of hell realm. But it's not like this dualistic one-to-one correlation. So we can just receive that encouragement. So if we flip it around, the precept of not killing is, the inverse of it is skillful to cherish life. It is skillful to honor and protect and treat as valuable and worthy all of life, including my own, including everyone around me. It is skillful to not set up dehumanizing hierarchies. It is skillful to not buy into ideas that some people and their well-being is more valuable than others. So we can look at instances in the world where this kind of cutting off of life or dehumanizing is happening, and we can, as bodhisattva practitioners, so by we here I mean as bodhisattva practitioners, we can wonder about how to engage with those situations to interrupt the killing that's happening, even on a subtle level. How do we do that? And again, like externally and internally. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been reading a lot and hearing a lot and letting my heart turn a lot around the violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States, as we've mentioned a few times already, and and hearing from many people who are Asian American or Pacific Islander about this continuum of violence. And this is true for us as for anyone that's on the oppression end of a hierarchy. That there are egregious acts like the mass murder in Atlanta, where 6 of the 8 people killed were Asian women, for example. But that there's a continuum of violence, and that even a moment where somebody says to somebody who appears to be Asian or Asian American, where are you from? And the person says, I'm from Toledo. And the person follows up again with, but where are you really from? And the implication there being like, you don't belong here. You don't look white. You must not be American. That actually is, it's a kind of violence. It's a kind of cutting off of the wholeness of the person in front of them. It's taking an assumption. And the reason, and part of the reason why it's extremely painful to be on the receiving end of something like that is that that moment that just seems maybe like an inquiry from the person asking the question, like, oh, I'm just curious. Maybe they're curious about what the person's like ethnic heritage is, but that's not the question being asked. It seems like, oh, it's an innocent question. I've heard people say that actually. I've probably had that same thought myself, actually, asking someone about where they're from. Part of the reason that I've heard people describe it being painful, and I have correlates in my own life around this, is that the full force of systemic oppression is behind that question. And that's what you feel when you're on the receiving end of it. So the question, the implication that you don't belong is bound up with a whole history that includes things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is this explicit piece of legislation in the United States that is explicitly racist. It says like Chinese people explicitly are not allowed to immigrate to the United States in the I think it was in the 1860s, for example. So these things so people, the word microaggressions has been used to, like these moments that seem like small transgressions. There's 2 teachings about this that have impacted me really deeply that I wanted to share with all of us. The first was Ibram Kendi's teaching around microaggressions. He's like, people use the word microaggressions. He's like, I use the term racial violence. Like that there's nothing micro about even what maybe dominant culture or dominant white culture would like to call a small act of racism. Another instance that I've heard a number of Asian Americans use as an act of dehumanization or an example is when it's often teenage boys, and my guess is that these are often white teenage boys, come up to people who are Asian and speak in like fake Chinese. Have people seen this happen in their lifetimes? I'm just gonna look and see if anyone else has witnessed this, because I feel like I've witnessed this, especially when I was younger, on many occasions. So a white, usually American male, coming up to people who are Asian and pretending to speak Chinese. And it's this, again, it's an othering. And again, it's loaded with the weight. It's loaded for the receiver, it's loaded with the weight of systemic oppression. For the perpetrator, or for the, even if it's a child doing it, if it's a white male American child doing it, that's also loaded with the weight of what it means to be white and male and American. I've experienced this myself, particularly as a woman. White male American children not being sanctioned when they are diminishing to me, even as an adult, dismissing me, or being rude to me, or being misogynist to me, and like noticing that the adults around them don't sanction them, Don't say like, we don't talk to adults that way. We don't talk to women that way. You know, everyone just kind of gets a little awkward in my experience often. People get a little awkward and kind of shift. And sometimes I'll say, oh, you shouldn't speak to adults like that. If it's a younger child, I feel permission. I feel a sense of community, actually. I feel a sense of responsibility to help, especially young male identified beings, understand like, this isn't okay. You're not allowed to speak to me that way. I'm not lower than you, actually, in any kind of hierarchy, even the one that you may have been given, which says that women are less than male beings. So these things I'll talk in a little bit about a training that I want to point everyone to that's so interesting about bystander intervention. But one of the principles they work with is that these what are considered smaller moments of aggression create an environment where more egregious acts of aggression actually come from. That these little seeds of tolerance and of perpetrating grow into greater forms of violence. And so a place of agency that we have as human beings, and we as human beings, we as citizens, but also we as bodhisattva practitioners, is that we interrupt these what would be considered smaller moments of violence, that we don't tolerate them, that we create a society that responds to them and says, no, that's not okay, actually, so that we can, so that we are not constantly creating fertile ground for more egregious acts of violence. It's almost like the understanding is violence, and we don't tolerate it because we care for one another, because we see one another, because we value one another, we value ourselves and one another. And maybe that's a really important piece right there. We value ourselves and one another. I've been thinking often lately about the harm that comes from being on the dominant end of these things, from being in the position of privilege. The harm that comes if there's a young teenage boy who hasn't been taught any better, speaking disrespectfully to me as a woman or speaking disrespectfully to someone as an Asian American, that's a diminishment of that child's own humanity. And not only for myself or for somebody else do I want to interrupt that, but because I value that child's humanity, I want to interrupt that. I don't want to let that child run with the idea that somehow actually it's okay for them to be violent towards other people and to be aggressive for their own well-being, for their own sense of what it means to be human. I have that feeling. So sometimes I think partly because I'm a parent and I do have a feeling of a common, that children are commons. Every now and then I have been able to interrupt stuff happening like that, but not always. Because, I have a lot of training around being quiet and not making people uncomfortable or not rocking the boat or not moving into conflict. I just have a lot of training around that. A lot of my cultural conditioning has put me in that position. So I want to take a minute to ask us to, if you can, for each of us to settle for a second in our body and see if you can recall an incident where, and again, not necessarily an egregious act of violence. See if you can remember an incident you were witnessing, so not one that you were perpetrating, but where you're witnessing somebody be dehumanizing to another person. This may be from childhood or maybe more recently. This may be, and what may be happening in the power differential is, maybe it is an act of misogyny or of racism or of transphobia, or, and it could be subtle, like where are you from, or, being confused about someone's gender and putting that on them, or anything like this. for me, I have a couple of instances actually that I'll share about men commenting on women's bodies and how that impacts me. So just take a few moments, take a few breaths and call to mind a scenario you can think of where you saw this happening. You saw someone in a position of relative power or imagined power, putting someone else down, knowingly or unknowingly. And if you can, bring to mind as much detail as you can of the incident or the moment. Like, where were you precisely, if you can remember? And how much sensory memory do you have? Try to really come into your body in the memory. Where were you? I mean, what was the temperature like? Who else was there? Do you remember anything about your emotional state? What were you seeing? What were you hearing? What were you smelling or tasting, if those memories are available? And what thoughts did you have? What feelings? What did witnessing this incident elicit in your physical body and in your mind and in your heart? So just by way of working with an example, I'll tell you an incident I had in my mind, which was, I think it was last summer, although it might have been the fall, but I can't tell the difference between the summer and the fall because it was so hot. What I remember was that it was hot and I was sort of in a hurry and I thought I would zip by Trader Joe's. So that for me, the emotional conditions were like I was hurrying. I kind of forgot about COVID. So I got to the Trader Joe's and like there's this long line of us waiting to go in. We were gonna have to stand there in the heat. And I was like, so there's a lot of kind of frustration and unanticipated irritations to begin with. It was also significant that it was hot because people were wearing clothes that you wear in hot weather, you know. And I was standing in my little square and in front of me was a young woman who was wearing, I think, like a tank top or something. And I think everyone in this scenario is white, including me. And an older man who seems to have a lot of physical limitations, kind of, his walking was quite strained. An older white man was kind of shuffling along the line to get to the end of the line. And as he came to the young woman in front of me, he stopped and he looked at her and he was like, I really like your top. He's commenting on her shirt. And I think he actually even said out loud, I like how much of your skin is showing. And it got creepy at that moment, for me anyway. It got uncomfortable. He also, you know, it's possible actually too that he may have been working with some cognitive impairment, so I want to name them. But for me, as a human female in this country, a bunch of my buttons are now being pushed watching this incident. And the young woman does what I myself have done a million times, you know. She's like, oh, ha, 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 ha. Thank you. She sort of brushes it off and, you know, oh, okay, yeah, ha, ha. You know, you can, and there's like this rippling of discomfort. Everybody around is kind of noticing this weird interaction and is feeling uncomfortable and nobody's saying anything, including myself. And I'm actually now becoming sort of enraged because of, and again, I can acknowledge, like, because I have been harmed by this kind of energy since I was a child. When I think about this, like, you know, beginning when I was about 11, men would honk at me and wave at me and whistle at me and make me, And just to name, for those of you who are not in a female embodiment, I never once felt complimented. All I felt was that I was in danger. And I think that's kind of what's being communicated. You know, I'm objectifying you. You're not human. You're in danger. And then he went behind me, but another young woman actually come behind me first. So now there's the young woman, but now the young one with the tank top, at least I'm between her and the man at this point, thinking like, well, if he says anything again, I'm just going to say something. Then he starts talking to the young woman behind me, and he's wanting to know what she's buying. And she's just, again, also accommodating. She's also a young white woman, being accommodating. And again, there's some other dynamics going on, right? This is an elder to all of us. And so she's accommodating. What are you buying? And she tells him for whatever reason, I don't know why, she's just accommodating. And then he's like, maybe to have dinner with your boyfriend. And again, like the creepiness came in right there. And everyone was like, and she's like, and I can't remember what she said, actually. I was kind of hoping she'd be like, no, for my 2 girlfriends, leave me alone. But she didn't. She just said like, oh, ha, 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 ha. You know, this is this thing that women do. We're not really engaging with you. We're just trying to like do the minimal to get out of the in conversation. And I'm thinking, now I'm actually thinking to myself, I'm grounding myself. I know I'm triggered, but I'm grounding myself in my body. And I'm thinking, just turn around and say to her, do you want to switch places in line? But I didn't. And eventually he kind of stopped talking, but he kept trying to have a conversation with her. And it was so irritating to me that days later, when I was having therapy with my therapist, this incident is what comes to mind. And I'm like mad that days have gone by. I mean, actually you could ask Charlie. I probably talked to him about it like 4 times. I'm like, why? First of all, I'm just mad that I still have to think about this. I'm mad that I had to watch it. And I'm mad at myself that I didn't do anything. And my therapist very skillfully named for me, well, you know, freezing is a trauma response. And I was like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. I've been conditioned as a human being to freeze in these situations, actually. And actually what in terms of trauma responses, which, you know, just to pull a little from psychology, we know that trauma responses are fight, flight, freeze. And then often people are adding this other now of fawning or pleasing. So accommodating also can be understood as a trauma response in that situation. And I was realizing that for myself, several things were happening. I actually felt the fight response in the sense that like I felt enraged, but more than that, I was feeling the freezing response. And I could not do anything in that moment. And I think I made up some stories for myself that, you know, I don't know, I didn't want to be rude to the old man, and I didn't want to make people uncomfortable. I didn't know if these women, but anyway, all the justifications that I've been taught actually to keep myself silent, to allow this kind of, it is a kind of violence, you know. And it's violence that I've perpetrated. I can name that. Like, this kind of system is so internalized in me. I have objectified other women. I have been objectified. And I can name, this is always, on the receiving end, for myself anyway, this is always a feeling of diminishment. I do not feel appreciated when someone's like, oh, you look so pretty, and I know that it's meant to be a compliment. It never feels that way. It always feels like I'm being objectified. And in that, the fullness of my humanity is not being acknowledged. I'm not, you know, human beings are not visual experiences for other people. We are complicated creatures. And to be reduced to a visual image is painful. So one of the things that I have learned to do in the past couple of years, in part through like the anti-racist work, because a lot of my training, a lot of the traumatic impacts that I, even as a white person, have around watching racist stuff happen is that I freeze. And a lot of white people talk about this as well. My trauma, my response is to be frozen. Like I can't even really, even my mind gets kind of frozen. Like I can't even really understand what I'm looking at when someone's being racist in a given moment. And then what I often do later is go into my mind and have some kind of ridiculous level of heroic response, you know, when I think about it later. And this is sort of adaptive. I would say this is pretty adaptive because at least I'm giving myself some agency later on. So we can use our imagination to go back to situations where our agency was removed, you know, and because of conditioning, and imagine what we would have said. So, you know, and even in that one, I kind of just went back and I let myself turn to the woman behind me and say, if you're feeling uncomfortable, would you like to trade places? It's pretty simple. It's something I actually usually would be capable of. And I actually did it a number of times in my mind. And because I realized, like, I don't want to have another one of these moments where I have to spend days later beating myself up about not saying something. But more than that, I don't want to be a part of tolerating that. I don't want to be a part of creating a world that says it's okay to do that to someone else. But on last week, I did a training with this group called Hollaback. And this is posted on our website so we posted some resources about interrupting violence against Asian Americans. And we are going to come back to your memory, just so you know. So keep it there in your pocket. I did this training, and they're offering these trainings. It's called like bystander intervention trainings. What we can collectively do to interrupt violence on these more this more kind of micro level. Oh, sorry. The second teaching about the term microaggression that I learned that was really impactful for me is micro doesn't refer to the aggression itself. It refers to the scale. So that a microaggression is one that happens between two people, like instead of like an institution to a person. But I would also say that we have to understand that even in a microaggression, there's the weight of systemic violence is there. And so it's never really just between two people. But they were teaching about what we can do as like engaged bodhisattvic citizens when there are instances of dehumanization and violence. That's, you know, maybe many of us have been trained to dismiss as like, well, it's not like someone hitting someone. It's just words, or it's just being rude, or what we can do. And what I think is really there's a couple pieces that are really important that I wanted to share with our community and have us collectively hold. And the first is, again, this idea that it's an ocean of millions of tiny moments that creates a violence, that creates a field in which more egregious violence is possible. And so again, as bodhisattvas, we start to see like, oh, even what seems like a little transgression is something I really want to interrupt because of its relationship to a more egregious aggression. And the other part that I really loved was that heroic direct interventions, where you run in and you're just like, stop that, it's not okay, is going to be the rarest form of intervention. So and I want to really give them credit and I recommend checking it out. It's only an hour training. It's offered freely. I went on Thursday afternoon and they were offering like 5 of these in a week, and they've been offering them for weeks. And there were 3,100 people there. So it was really encouraging. Actually, some of the organizers were kind of tearing up about it. So they offer what they call them the 5 Ds of intervention. And the first one, so direct is the fifth one. And again, the one that they recommend most rarely using. The first one is distraction. Like just do something that interrupts the dynamic. They gave the example, like if you're in a grocery store and some person is acting aggressively toward another person and you're like on aisle 4 and you're sort of seeing this happen, knock something over. They're like, it makes a big noise. There's a cleanup on aisle 4. The whole dynamic gets mixed up. Another example of this that I really liked was, and this is for those of us that are maybe more dramatic. So someone is being targeted by an instance of racial or other kinds of violence. You pretend like you know the person being targeted. Oh, Sally, it's so good to see you. I'm so sorry I'm late. You know, like you just come in with this, like you just bring in like a completely different energy. And then you are like, oh, sorry, I thought you were my friend that I was waiting for. You know, like you just shake up what's happening. You just distract. Or you just yell out like, I think I'm in labor or something like that. Just get everyone to move away from the thing that's building, that's violating. Other possibilities from distraction are you can delegate. So say to some person, like they were naming, well, maybe you're there with your children and you can't, and you're afraid of the violence coming towards you, but you can say to somebody, hey, could you do this? Or, hey, will you go get help? I'm going to stay here and at least witness. Or, and another one was to document, get out your cell phone and use your judgment, whether you're surreptitiously or obviously filming the incident. Sometimes just obviously filming the incident actually slows a perpetrator down. Another one is they call delay. And what they mean is after the incident happens, you go up to the person and say, I saw that happen. It wasn't okay. Is there some way I can help you right now? So that's kind of a big one. They said they did a study in conjunction with Syracuse University and found if someone was the victim of a racist incident and a person who was a bystander even just gave them a knowing glance or made eye contact and smiled, even that small instance of contact, of human contact following this dehumanization, reduced the traumatic impact on the victim. So or even just like shaking your head and saying like, that really wasn't okay. It validates for the person who's on the receiving end that actually happened and it was bad and other people think it's bad. And I'm here with you. I see you. Part of what happens when we don't respond is that we are complicit in the violence. So I want to give us, so wait, did I get to all of these? So there's distract, delegate. Oh, okay, yeah. Document, delay. And then the last one is direct intervention. And their recommendation is you only ever use direct intervention when you know the perpetrator and you feel safe to do direct intervention. And that really, for me, that was very interesting information. If you're watching an incident happen in public and you don't know the person doing the perpetrating, it's not actually a safe enough environment for you to do a direct intervention. So these heroic imaginings that we have in our mind are actually not what they recommend, even though they might, be what we see in the movies and aspire to. And I think that's really neat because when we go back and revisit things, we can include the heroic intervention if we want to, just for imagining a better world where we can all be heroes. But we can also include more subtle interventions, like going up to the person afterward and saying, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I'm here with you now. And is there something I can do? So this has gotten longer, but because we're imagining, I do want to give us the opportunity to take a minute and go back to the incident that you were imagining before and engage your bodhisattva imagination. See if you can settle into your body and your heart and consider the question like, what do I really want to have happen here for everyone involved, including the person who's doing the harming. And just and even if it's absurd, right? Even if it's an intervention that you could never imagine being received, go ahead and just imagine it. What would it look like to interrupt a moment like that and have it turn out well? And know that this is something we can do to work with our conditioning that says that we can't do anything. We can go back over it in our mind, and we can give ourselves the agency that our cultural conditioning may have taken from us. In the incident at Trader Joe's, I can just imagine myself turning to the young woman behind me and saying, "Would you like to trade places?" But to expand it further, I can imagine saying to the older man, when you comment on women's bodies, it can make us uncomfortable. And him saying, "Oh, thank you." And I'm laughing because I think it's absurd. He would probably be too defensive. It would probably not be something he would do, but I can go ahead and imagine that. "Oh, thank you. That's right. I've received this feedback before, and thank you for reminding me. That is my intention, to treat other people with great respect." And I forgot for a minute. So just in conclusion, I want to share that I was reading a review of a children's book called What You Don't Know by Anastasia Higginbotham. And what the book is about, essentially, is answering the question, what if you never had to come out of the closet because you were never in there in the first place? So it's about a child who's non-binary and maybe gender and maybe queer in their sexual orientation, and that like the world that they live in, where they never, coming out of the closet was never a thing that they had to do because they were never in the closet, because their family and society never put them there, because who they were was never communicated to be unacceptable. And it really, really touched me. And I looked up the book and could see some of it online. And it opens with a quote from Billy Porter, the wonderful artist. I recommend maybe checking him out if you don't know him. And the quote is, who's a non-binary person. And the quote is, "I don't need tolerance. I don't need acceptance. What we demand is your respect for our humanity." So as Bodhisattva practitioners, I feel like this is our work, to imagine how we engage in the world and rehumanize the places where dehumanization has become normal. And some of the skills I wanted to just begin to offer this morning are grounding in our body so that we counter the habits of trauma responses, allowing ourselves to imagine into different possibilities than the ones that we have been given and have seen, taking a posture of reverence internally and externally toward other human beings, and engaging these possibilities that come from that holoback training of like how then we might actually engage and not allow instances of dehumanization to pass without our rehumanizing being a part of what's happening. Thank you very much. So please, that might be one of the longest talks I've ever given. Thank you for staying with me. But I did really want to give us time to have our own experiences, and yeah, and yes, so please go ahead, Donna. Yeah.
Thanks, Dojin. I really can relate to your talk in many ways, especially as a woman. But I wanted to, I don't even know how to word the question, but kind of putting it into context with a conversation that I had with a very close friend of mine who's Chinese American, second, third generation, depending on which parent you're talking about, who's shared with me over the many years a lot of micro and, I don't know, macroaggressions that have happened toward her. But I approached her recently with the question of microaggressions, and that as a white privileged person in a community of very few people of color, that I don't often have the opportunity to practice speaking up and getting to know people of color, and it can make me freeze even before I say anything. And that is not something I want to happen. I want to be able to engage with everyone and feel comfortable doing so. So when I've been working as a volunteer in the clinics, we have travelers who are from all over the United States. Probably 95% of them are Black. And it's been an incredible experience to watch the white people interacting with them. And also for me to engage, to try to get to know them. And can I say, where are you from? And it's like, so I'm saying, what state are you from? Because that's what my question's really about. Like, are you from the South? Are you from the Midwest? Are you from the middle, part of the country? So anyway, but I just wanted to bring that up and see if you have anything more to say about it, because when I spoke to my friend, and she really, really strongly cautioned me to kind of like do away with that concern for yourself about microaggressions, because I know you and I know where you're coming from, and I don't want you not to speak up. I want you to feel comfortable. And I have that concern about people in our community when they are trying to understand microaggressions, how to deal with this. So do you have any advice?
I don't know. I mean, so you mean like about kind of not saying anything because you're afraid of transgressing and.
Yeah, what can I say to this person to get to know them? Well, I mean, obviously, how are you doing today? But, to really get some conversation rolling, how do you ask where somebody's from if they're a person?
Well, I wonder if what happens as an experiment if you're more explicit about what you're doing. And like on a whole bunch of levels. So what would happen if you could say to the person, I'm wanting to get to know you. And I'm wondering if there are things that you feel comfortable sharing with me that would help me have a sense of that. Even that is tricky. Or I've heard this spoken about a lot of times as particularly a lot of white folks are socialized to feel like we're entitled to know. And so it may like, so then even, could you be even more explicit? Like, I understand I'm standing here as a white woman asking this question of you, and that might be loaded. And I'd like to get to know you, And so like, yeah, I just wonder like how explicit we can be first with ourselves and then with others, just naming and giving permission, instead of being like, tell me where you're from, is really different than, I'm curious to know more about you. Is there anything you're comfortable sharing with me? Mm-hmm. It's a really different feeling, and it takes out again, like the legacies of entitlement, that white people are entitled to know. That your people of color are just there for my entertainment or my, like there are histories of this, like you're there to enrich me with your differentness, that kind of thing. So that question can dovetail with that kind of history. So interrupting that with being explicit. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would imagine that would be hard to do because we're not, many white people are not socialized to be direct. Mm-hmm. We're not even socialized to be conscious, let alone to be direct, So it's really challenging, but I think it could be really interesting to try to do that. Like as a practice of the path of skillful speech,
Mhm.
How do I have this interaction? So not to not have the interaction, but to do it with a lot of explicitness. That's just one thought.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there other thoughts? I'm curious if anyone wants to share, like what memory you had, and did anyone get to a feeling of liberation around how you could redo the the incident? Oh yeah, Richard, please go ahead.
So Dojin, my memories are not of witnessing somebody else. It's me doing something stupid. And it's usually with people who have either who are obviously not originally from the United States or this country, and me asking them where they're from. And I get myself in trouble by doing that. But my motives are, I travel and I like to know about other countries and other cultures and other perspectives. And so the innocence is there, but I realize that the microaggression sometimes really doesn't help people or help me get to know them. So that's just a comment.
One reframing I would offer for you, Richard, is instead of saying, these are just instances of me doing something stupid, I would offer the reframe of I can think of instances of me kind of playing out the conditioning I've been handed. It's because that is what it is, like, yes, there's ignorance in it, but you're not willfully being ignorant. It's just, these are the conditioning you've been handed is you. And again, so now you're a white American man, that's a whole bunch of privilege. You're a straight white American man, your class, even like there's a lot of privilege, right? And then I think what we can do as people who want to care for the suffering in the world is understand what the location that I occupy, the baggage that comes with that societally, right? So like if like a Latina woman is asking another person who appears to be a Latina woman, where are you from? That's a different situation than a white American man asking somebody who appears to be a Latino woman, where are you from? And it's got all those loaded, and this is this thing again, like this isn't, and people, this is Buddhism, like in the sense that like this is right view of understanding, like yes, I'm an individual, but I'm part of all these systems of, and they have a lot of weight and they have a lot of bearing. And one of the things I can do, again, as a bodhisattva being is, or someone interested in caring for the suffering in the world, is understanding what happens when I bring the particular identities I occupy into a field. Yeah, and so again, for you, Richard, like I'd be so curious, what would happen if you would say something similar to, I would like to get to know you better, if that's comfortable for you, and I'm curious about anything you'd like to share about yourself, if you'd like to. And again, like adding in all those pieces, it doesn't come from a place of domination and entitlement. It comes from naming that you want connection, being explicit about that, and really naming that the other person has permission to say yes or no. And one of the things I think for those of us who are acculturated as white that we might need to get really okay with is that people who are people of color may not want the connection with us, and that's okay, because there has been so much harm. It's not personal. We can, like, it's a kind of grace to allow, like, and you don't have to, So that's something I recommend.
Is there a way that you got any idea as far as a good way to ask them about their, their background, whether they're from China or whatever, if we're just basically curious and, been everywhere, because you could say, I want to get to know you, but maybe that, that wouldn't get to the point. So do you have something you can say that would be inoffensive?
Well, that's where I feel like we then, so along with being explicit and saying, I'd like to get to know you and naming our desire for connection, we need to, as white folks, do the work internally of like, why am I asking? You know, why do I find, why am I curious this way? Why do I feel entitled to know? Could I be okay with never knowing? Could I be okay if they're not comfortable sharing? Because like, again, like if people are, for example, if someone's undocumented, they do not want to share their background with you. It's too threatening, right? Like that's dangerous actually for them. Could we be okay with knowing, could having connection with them that they're comfortable sharing with us and not meeting my need to know or my feeling of like, well, I need to know. That gets into entitlement. And again, for white folks, when we see ourselves in entitlement, that's a place for us, again, as bodhisattvas to like really take care. And I would say as much as possible, back away and look at it later and talk to our Dharma friends about it. Like, hey, I just felt like I really wanted to know.
Well, I think about the gal who used to, before COVID came along, who would do pedicures for me. And, you know, I wanted to know where she came from, what her background was. And, you know, and it turns out, of course, she's from Vietnam. But I didn't, you know, she was like, oh, yeah, I came from there and blah, blah, blah. And you know, my sisters are here. And she was, you know, she didn't react poorly to that at all.
Yeah. So that was, but again, accommodating can be a trauma response. And you were probably in a power differential with that woman. That's pretty big, actually. Immigration status is a very massive power differential, especially now in the United States. So just being really careful. Yeah, Batra, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a lifetime being multiracial, and English is my second language. First thing I would say is why? It depends on, like the lady that said about she gets the manicure pedicure. That's someone most likely you're going to see what 5 times a year, whatever. You built some kind of a relationship with. I would start with I, not with a question. You know, and I really check out, really peel the layers back of why. If it's because you want to feel comfortable in your skin, because you're of European Caucasian, I wouldn't start there. Start with yourself very deeply. When I was at the congregation that I went to and will continue to go, more or less. I've been with this congregation for 7 years as an employee, a volunteer, etc. First time I was in the office as a volunteer at the desk 7 years ago, a European Caucasian lady, and there's a lot of things to this. I was sitting down, she was standing up right there, you know, right there, the power stand. I'm sitting down. She looks at me and she says, "What are you?" And I was just, whoa, that's one, her personality. Yes, her condition. And yes, it was her way of engaging. You know, I have to say it took, well, I'm talking about it now, so I still have energy around that, you know? So then, and then I'll finish with this. When I hear, well, we don't have any people of color. Well, you're living in Sonoma County in Sebastopol. And I said to one person, go to Community Baptist Church, then change your congregation, be, you know, well, or how come people of color don't come to your congregation? I said, there's nothing here for them. They got their own people, their own resources. You know what I'm saying? That's their tribe. That's where they're gonna, that's their tribe. So it's a very, you know, yeah. So just, and I have to say this, if anyone would like to speak with me about my experience, Creole is a mixture. And Mama Anna that raised me looked black and she looked like my grandma. So like you said, it's a whole bunch of stuff, you know, it's huge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Batra, for sharing your experience. And I feel I noticed protection arising, like not wanting everyone to come and be like, so can you explain this to me? And also I appreciate your you're sharing your experience, what it means to be mixed race, and a lot of vantage points on the racial dynamic is what I imagine is happening. Thank you all very much for being here this morning, and hopefully you know, we keep turning these ideas, and we keep turning the practice of looking, you know, engaging outwardly and also looking inwardly at what location we're occupying and what we hold and what conditioning we've received, and also like what our inmost request is around caring for the world and addressing suffering. So we'll finish with the closing chant. Just a second. Okay, that's in the chat. Thank you again. For great Bodhisattva vows, beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it. Thank you all very much for being here this morning, and yes, thank you.